I'd love to kick it off because I know we only have about 30 minutes for this discussion today. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the All Aboard chat series. It's really great to see so many familiar names and faces here in this space on Zoom. And I want to welcome anyone joining the discussion for the first time, whether joining on Zoom here with us or watching on Facebook Live. Thank you all for being here. As many of you know, Encompass works to make the farm to animal protection more effective by fostering greater racial diversity, equity, and inclusion in our space. And this chat series was really created to cultivate a space for some of these conversations on really pressing racial equity topics to take place and for us to come together to discuss how we can all really contribute to creating a more equitable movement. And for any of you who are joining us for the first time, if you're asking yourself, why is this called All Aboard? The reason is really simply because it takes everyone in our unique positions to show up for racial justice in order for us to create change. So I know there's a lot of folks joining us here as activists who are working professionally in the animal protection movement, folks who are in leadership positions. So really excited to engage in this conversation with you. And the topic that we're going to be exploring today is 1 year after the racial justice uprising of 2020, what's happened since your BLM statement? So we really want to spend some time digging into our commitments, what progress has looked like for each of us, and then how we can also keep the momentum going. So our goal in hosting this is to really create a community of practice. And what that means is that we're all here today because we care about racial equity, and we each have a unique opportunity to learn from one another and learn together. So we really do want to encourage participation and open dialogue through this conversation. If you feel comfortable, please feel free to turn your cameras on so that we can better interact with one another. And if you have any questions during the call, you can share that either in the chat box or you can feel free to private message Amy Lubert, who's on the call, if you want to ask something anonymously to the group. So with that being said, I'd love to kick it off with some introductions and would like to ask each of you joining us to share in the chat box your name, your pronouns, and where you're joining us from. And for those of you who may not know me, my name is Shayna and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm based in New York. And I currently serve on the board of directors of Encompass as the board chair, and I'm also the organizing manager for the US for Mercy for Animals. And I'm thrilled today to introduce Doris Quintanilla to our space. Doris is the executive director and co-founder of an organization that I'm sure many of you are familiar with called the Melanin Collective. So Doris, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to meet with you all and discuss these important topics. I come from the nonprofit sector, but I have been, I left after 10 years of burnout and doing everything but my job, to start that Melanin Collective, to really center the experiences of women of color and people with disabilities in this work, which you think would be what's centered, but is not. And so I'm also a part of the advisory council for Encompass. I'm really excited to talk to you all today.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Doris. So just to help us kick this off and understand how each of you are showing up for this discussion today, we are going to launch a quick poll and you can select all the responses that apply. So we've just launched it now. And we're really interested to know, are you coming into this space as an employee or a volunteer of an organization that has made racial equity commitments? Has the organization not yet made racial equity commitments? Or are you kind of showing up as an individual who's made some personal commitments, or have you not yet gotten there yet? So we see some responses coming through. Looks like we have 50% so far. We'll wait a couple more moments for folks to submit their answers. And again, you can select all that apply, because I know that a lot of folks are both coming in with personal commitments, but also coming in from organizations that are engaged in this work as well. All right, and it looks like we've got a good number of folks, so we can go ahead and end the poll. And it's great to see, it looks like the majority of us are coming in as employees and volunteers of organizations that have made racial equity commitments. So that's really great to hear. A big part of this conversation today is going to be centering around how have those commitments looked and what progress are we making. And there's a couple of folks here who are coming from organizations. It looks like one person who hasn't yet made racial equity commitments. So that'll be a really good lens for us to consider. What are the barriers to doing so? And a lot of folks who are also doing work on a personal level. So thank you all for sharing that. And here are the results here. Oh, I think we already shared that, sorry. Just closing out the poll here. So really great to see how you're all showing up here. And I'd love to kick things off by just passing a question to Doris that, you know, as we're all really reflecting on this, I'm interested to hear from you, and I wonder if other folks are interested to hear, just as someone working in this realm of work, what has your experience been so far on where most groups in the progressive space are with this type of work, and how things have changed or not changed a year after these racial justice uprisings?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. I want to say also I'm on Tonga land. I'm in California right now, but I'm usually in DC. I'm just visiting my mom. So I was like, what land is this? Yeah, so I think there has been a ton of movement in this work, and it has been driven predominantly by staff and volunteers, right? People who don't usually have power within the organizations, demanding a change, and then asking, and then keeping leadership accountable. What does that look like? Where have we not done this? I think that is the biggest push, right? This is part of like the biggest workers' rights movement as well. And I think it is prompted by BLM and by the murder of George Floyd, where people are finally paying attention, and the pandemic, right? Let's add that on top of everything of like, what does it mean to be a human being in the United States, and especially to be a Black and Brown human being. And so there has been a big shift and change where organizations didn't think it was important and they could do it and it was cool, all right? And now it's like, it's the basic standard. We want you to have a statement. We want you to be working on racial justice and equity within your organization. I feel like it starts with diversity, equity, inclusion, right? That's the basics. And then we move into racial justice and equity. What else? Organizations and individuals have made commitments. It looks so many different ways, right? There's a lot of unionization going on. So when staff feel like and employees feel like people are not making a difference or deciding to actually change on their own, they have been unionizing, which I think is really important. And the best part of that is that racial justice and equity has been built into union contracts, and it looks very different than it has in the past. And everything is trial and error. So I think we have to extend some grace for folks, but things will change and it will only get better. So the commitments include not just hiring people of color, right, for like positions that have no power, but it's actually putting people of color in positions of power and then giving them agency to do the work, right? Because those are different things that we learn when people get into organizations. There's also a lot of leadership stepping down. I've seen a lot of white women stepping down from their organizations, the nonprofit sector, and then replacing them with women of color, Black leaders, which I think is really important, and it's a big step. And so, yeah, I think the change is coming. It's slower than what we want, but it's actually, I think, in reference to everything that has been happening, I think this is the biggest shift that we've seen. And as long as we keep up, right, pushing and asking and demanding, I think it'll continue to grow. And this is the bare minimum we can expect from the progressive movement. And I think we need to keep pushing that, right? Live your mission, vision, and values within your organization as much as we say we live them outside of our organization.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Doris. And, you know, I feel like in my experience too, that makes a lot of sense, where a lot is being driven from the bottom up as well. Obviously, leadership buy-in is really crucial in that. But it really takes, you know, again, all aboard, it takes everyone to do the work and actually implement it and make it happen. So as we move on to the next question, I'm actually curious to hear from the audience as well. What are some examples of the commitments that your organization has made or that you've made as an individual? And you can just go ahead and share that in the chat box. And if you're coming from a space where I know somebody said that they're in an organization that hasn't made commitments, what are some of the roadblocks that, you know, are being encountered? And again, if you want to share any of this anonymously, you can also send it to Amy, and Amy can relay it as well. I know that some folks are here in spaces with other people that we're, you know, in community with in our day-to-day work as well. So yeah, if you can share again, what are examples of commitments that you or your organization have made, and what are some of the roadblocks that you're encountering in either making progress or in making those commitments? So we'll be interested in seeing that. I'll give you all some time to share and contribute. But in the meantime, I do want to move into a question for Amy, or sorry, not for Amy, but for Doris. Amy, we'll ask you more questions later. But a challenge that I've seen organizations kind of facing as we're furthering our commitments around racial equity is not just about leadership buy-in, but is also about the organizational buy-in. So obviously last time we met in the space, we talked about the need for leadership buy-in for this work to actually happen and for it to be effective. But even though a leadership team may be invested, I've seen that some other levels of organizations still have some of that tension. So Doris, I'm curious to know, what kind of advice would you give to organizational leaders for how they can get teams on board with this work and really trickle down that buy-in across the organization?
For sure. I mean, the most important part is to make this and embed this into all levels of your organization. So is a requirement for racial justice and equity and understanding and how you function when you come into the culture, is that part of the job descriptions, right? Is that part of your performance evaluation? So whether you like it or not, if I am required to be a manager, this is what it looks like to be a manager, and I get evaluated every year, right? So in that, then I'm also going to add racial justice and equity. So can I manage a team of diverse staff? Can I keep a team of diverse staff, right? So it's not about hiring us, it's about keeping us. And I think that's where the biggest problems are. And that's your manager, right? Manager has the most impact on whether someone will stay in an organization or not. And so so by embedding it in your job descriptions, in your annual reviews, and just making it a part of like your value statement, right? Be vocal about it. I think there's a lot of organizations doing great work, and there's no diversity statement on their website. They have no goals or plans, right? So people are not sure what's going on. And so if BIPOC folk are looking for that job, they're going to be looking for your online face. What does it look like? How inclusive are you? And so, you know, if you don't have people on board and don't have that set expectation, then it's not going to happen. And one of the biggest pushback is, well, what if they leave? BIPOC folks leave all the time, right? So don't you want people to leave who are not in alignment with your values and the work that you're trying to do, instead of just trying to coddle people and letting them kind of skirt by? So make it a part of their job, and then they just have to do it. And if they don't like it, they can go somewhere else, and they're going to run out of places to go, right? Because this is a big change that's happening.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I actually really appreciate the thought about like adding it into your job descriptions, because a lot of the conversations that I've personally been engaged in, and I wonder if folks on this call, I see a couple head nods, if this also resonates, but when thinking about, again, the work also being driven from the bottom up, I think another question is that, you know, how can individuals also take ownership over this when it is unclear where this work falls, or who should own it, who should be driving it? And a suggestion that I have heard that now you've kind of like reinforced is that maybe there should be more of this included in our job descriptions. So what other steps, you know, do you think that individuals can take to help really influence and, you know, move the pace of this work forward, and encourage obviously other people to buy in as well, in addition to the leadership efforts? And obviously this is with the ultimate goal of helping animals at the end of the day, right? And it's really seeing that alignment, I think.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, I think individuals have to do their own education, right? We call it your learning and unlearning journey. Like, what are the things you're carrying? What are the things that you're doing? I recommend everyone do therapy, right? There are just things that you are not aware of that you're doing, and how they impact folks. And so educate yourself, do your own homework type thing, and then own your mistakes. I think part of the problem in white supremacy culture is this wanting to be perfect, right? So a lot of organizations, leaders, us as individuals don't want to do the work because we might make a mistake, but that's how you learn, right? You're going to learn way more from making an error than never, you know, treading far because you're afraid of what could happen. And so that, I also keep vocal. Like, I did this training, I thought it was great, share it with your colleagues. I think bystander intervention is like the best thing ever. So if you don't know how to deal with awkward situations, you can learn to, right? And when you see something like racism happening, or you know, just like any type of bias, gender bias happening in a meeting or a session, you can interrupt that. And there's a great bias interrupters. They have a whole website, like how to interrupt bias in meetings, in hiring, in whatever you want, it's there. And that's really helpful. So being, you know, we say we model the behavior we want to achieve. And so making sure that you're the one modeling the behavior, you're the one asking the questions, not always putting that on BIPOC folks. And not always expecting BIPOC folks to bring it up, right? So if they really cared, they would bring it up. No, we're exhausted, right? I get paid to bring this up. And even so, I have to pick my battles. What is it that I'm going to spend my energy on, and what am I not going to do this? So yeah, sorry, allergies. I think the mission drift conversation is really important, right? Every sector is having this. Like, why should we care about racial justice and equity? We're a sexual reproductive health organization. And I'm like, the diagrams, right? The Venn diagram is just a circle. It's not even a Venn diagram anymore of how Black moms and their children, right, are affected by maternal morbidity and mortality. Why we should care about Black folks, right? This is something that I think every sector, every organization, every company is having a conversation on, but I think at the end of the day, you need people to do the work that you're doing, right? And the best teams are diverse teams. The most strategic and successful teams are ones that have different ideas and people working on them. And so if you want to be successful, right, you have to have every kind of representation in the movement, right? And as we saw, BIPOC folk led to this new election, right, to getting rid of the previous president. And so I think it matters. And I just feel like it's hard to convince people of like, this is why if it's too hard to convince someone like why a human being should matter, then I don't really care about your love for animals or not. Like, you know, you have to start with people and the people around you and the people that you love first. And then everyone else benefits, right? And so every movement will benefit by centering the most impacted, which happens to be BIPOC folks.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, you're really speaking to where one of the greatest opportunities for us to get organizational buy-in lies is making sure that folks understand that it's deeply embedded in our work and that we will ultimately be more impactful, more effective in our ultimate goal of helping animals, the better we can collaborate in these spaces and foster greater diversity and inclusion, and of course, equity. I want to draw folks' attention to the chat box where Amy just shared, I believe, one of the resources that Doris mentioned, and also want to thank folks for starting to share some examples of the commitments that their organizations or on an individual level where they've been investing. Again, hopefully this sparks some ideas for folks about different things that your organization might work on or different things you might want to pursue as an individual. And also would love to hear, you know, in the chat box, what challenges are you facing too? What are some of the barriers to doing the work that are hindering progress or potentially just getting in the way a little bit or slowing it down? And again, if you have questions for Doris, also drop that in the chat box. We want to make space to allow her to share her expertise on things that you might be facing directly. So please do share in the chat box or message Amy if you want to share anonymously. But in the meantime, I want to go back to something that you said that just sort of sparked something in my mind around doing this work and who's doing this work, Doris. So, you know, as we know, there's many large animal protection organizations in our space that are predominantly white and predominantly white-led. And I've kind of seen, you know, some of the advancement of racial equity work fall into these two schools of thought around how to approach it and how to make progress on our commitments. And one is that, you know, white folks should bear the burden and responsibility of doing a lot of the work, including intensive learning and educational work at an organization. So for instance, maybe that looks like a team of white folks taking responsibility for conducting a DEI training and putting in the time, energy, and effort to do that for the organization. But on the other hand, the other perspective is that, you know, we actually want to be learning from people of the global majority that are actually impacted by these issues, and we want to hear their experience. So it's actually more important to have their voices amplified. So what are your thoughts about this, and how might you recommend organizations or individuals kind of address or even marry these two, you know, seemingly valid perspectives to move forward in their work and commitments?
Yeah, I for sure 100% think that white folks should not be conducting the trainings right now and having these conversations. I think there is a space for that, right? So there are like white privilege trainings and work that, or white fragility, as as well, right? There's that kind of stuff that can be done by white folks, but I think it's important to hear from the global majority, right? People of color, and what is their experience? What is their experience? And then any training, any curriculum that is developed, I think works in theory, and only BIPOC folk can tell you what it looks like in real life and how you can implement that in real life. And so I definitely do have a side eye for organizations that hire white consultants to come and do this work. I also think that it's hard for you to teach something that you haven't dismantled yourself, right? So if you haven't dismantled white supremacy and you hold all the power within your organization, again, a training by you is not going to be effective. So I think the best thing you can do is hire the experts and to invest in this process. So for us, that looks like a holistic culture and climate assessment, right? So we're paid to come and do a qualitative, quantitative, and anecdotal analysis of what it looks like to be the folks in your organization and what they're experiencing. Also, what are the barriers to hiring, recruiting, and retaining and promoting people of color? And so that is an outside perspective. I see a lot of organizations doing their own surveys. Like, no one's going to tell you the truth, right? Because they know you're going to read it, and in some way you can probably decipher who we are, and then there might be some retaliation, right? And so creating a safe and brave space for people to do this work is really important. And I think that's done from our lens and our perspective in a great way. And so we do have white folks, like I have a white man that works with the MC. And when there are white clients who can't hear me, I'm like, can you just come and say the same thing I just said? Thanks. And they hear all of a sudden, they're like, you know what, that's a great idea, right? So we also know, I'm not saying there shouldn't be anyone hiring, you shouldn't hire white consultants. I think that everyone has a place, right? If we're having focus groups and there's for white folks and there's no one, a facilitator that reflects them, no one wants to actually share or feel comfortable. So we definitely want to have folks that make you feel comfortable and able to share. But I think the work that leaders should do is invest in this work, is to hire coaches of color, right? I'm doing that now for a tech company. No, you're not going to get this other retired old white man to teach you anything. We are going to hire a beautiful Black woman that I know. Lakeisha Middleton is amazing. She's been in tech for 25 years and she can do this work way better, right? So I think being mindful of who you're hiring and not just people who are going to tell you what you want to hear is the most important. So part of having power is distributing that. And so maybe having your staff, say, this is who we like, right? Like do a big search that includes staff and have staff hire. A lot of organizations have the DEI committees, so have those folks lead this work, right? So yeah, I think it's distributing power and shared decision-making that's going to get this work to move forward.
That's great. And I did see that it looks like a lot of folks who have commitments are centered around committees, different meetings and conversation spaces as well. So great to see that a lot of folks at least have some of those foundational components. So Doris, thinking about, we've been talking a little bit about progress, what it looks like and kind of pushing that forward, who's doing that work and how we continue to advance it. But in order to hold ourselves really accountable to our commitments, there does need to be a really clear understanding of what our goals are, whether or not we're achieving them. So what do you think it looks like to really measure and evaluate progress effectively? Obviously, you talked to, one way that you just mentioned is using a consultant to help do these assessments and kind of figuring out that baseline so you can measure progress from there. But what are your thoughts on just that accountability and evaluation piece?
For sure. It's, if you want to get something done, you schedule it, right? If you want to get something done, you also measure it. So we ask folks to establish a baseline. Where is your organization right now? Where are its needs? That's often how you can prove, right? Like the business case of, is this work worth it? Is what does it look like now? What does it look like in a year from now? Doing this work, investing in the people. And so the first thing is to who makes up your organization, right? Record everything. Who's applying for your positions, right? Who actually gets hired for those positions? Who's leaving your organization? The biggest problem, right? What does retention look like? I've seen a lot of organizations, especially nonprofits, who have a higher turnover than restaurants, right? And that's before the pandemic. Obviously, that is different now, but those things are important, and not just what's the percentage of people leaving, but also what is the makeup? Is it all people of color? Is it all white women, right? Like all of that may mean something, and so making sure that you're recording all of that and that you have that information. and then you invest in the expertise, right? So if you need HR, then you hire HR experts to come with the racial justice and equity lens. And that's something you can ask now, right? Even like there's a compensation analysis happening, great. So do they have a pay equity lens? Is there a racial justice equity lens to that work? And if the answer is no, that's not who you want to hire, right? So every consultant, everyone doing this work now understands that. And if they don't, that's not someone that you need to employ. So making sure you establish a baseline and then base your goals and objectives on the findings, right? So we found that we are just really bad at hiring women of color. Okay, great. So what are we going to do in order to change that? Like, who are we partnering with? Where are we posting our job descriptions? What's the language we're using, right? There's a lot of coded language in these job descriptions that are meant to deter you from applying. And so how do we address that? And so those are the best ways to like use the information within your organization, the data that you already have. And if you don't, that's part of your goal. Start recording that data to help create a map, right? Like goals and objectives of what you want to work on, and then check in every 6 months, every year, because things will change, right? Things happen, leadership changes, whatever, but always go back to that and then update it, modify it, add new goals.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'd love to hear quickly in the chat box, folks sharing, do you have an accountability structure or an evaluation process right now to measure your progress on your commitments? Feel free to just put yes or no in the chat box, and we'll keep an eye there. So as we're nearing the end of this call, I just want to let folks who are joining us know that we will be staying on for just a few moments after. So if you do have a question that you didn't want to ask in the larger space, or if you want to get Doris's insight on a challenge or your own progress, we'll be here for a few minutes for you to ask at the end. But Doris, what final insight would you share with folks who are joining us today to help them keep the momentum going? So how can we keep moving forward and prioritizing this work as a lot of these, highly publicized protests and coverage has kind of died down?
For sure. I think it's establishing a community of practice, right? Which means you're coming together for a certain reason and then having goals around that work. So for a lot of folks, it's the Racial Justice and Equity Committee. These are the goals that we have. And part of that is documenting the win, like celebrating the wins, right? Things that you have accomplished, even though they're small, I think it's important to celebrate because it's very, like, you formed the committee. That's a great thing, right? There's volunteers who want to do this work. Sometimes you pay people to do this work. Those things, I think it's important because we get lost in like, we haven't, achieved all of these goals. Again, perfectionism is oppression. Acknowledge the wins, celebrate the wins. Also, like, take your lessons learned. So what did we learn in these 3 months? What worked, what didn't work? Who's the best at this work, right? Like, this person managing the project was not the greatest, the greatest, like, let's transition to someone else or whatever that looks like. And then document all of that, because at the end, or like in a year and 3 years and 5 years, you can look back and really see, this is how much work we've done. This is really what working on this looks like, right? And it's not always a celebration, but there are a lot of lessons learned. And if you learn something, that's just as important as a success. But it's really hard for people to hear that when we're trained, right, to be, especially in DC, right, to be these overachievers, perfectionists, trying to get everything right before you even start. I think just start wherever you are with whatever you have, and it'll grow from there.
Thank you so much, Doris. Well, it looks like we are just about at time. So I do want to thank everyone for joining us. And Doris, thank you so much for sharing all of your amazing insights. Amy's going to be dropping in some of your links to stay connected with the Melanin Collective and the work that Doris is doing. And before we round out, I just want to also share that we are excited to let folks know that Encompass's new book, Anti-Racism and Animal Advocacy, Igniting Cultural Transformation, is officially launching September 15th. And the book features a collection of Encompass essays that were inspired by our racial equity work and trainings and written by leaders of the movement. So be sure to check that out. We hope that you'll all consider pre-ordering it to support this work. You can visit encompassmovement.org/book to learn about it. The link is also going to be dropped in the chat box. Otherwise, we'll see you all next time at our upcoming All Aboard chat series taking place on October 12th, when we'll be exploring how do we balance making people comfortable and meeting people where they're at with our special guest, Paul Gorski. So you can register now to hold your spot using the link in the chat box as well. So thank you all again for coming and choosing to use your time to share with us and Doris on this topic.